Well, welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Today, we turn our attention back to Ukraine and what is going on in the battle with Russia. Lots of activity this week, some speculation about whether or not the Ukrainian counteroffensive is actually underway, and they're playing it a little bit more quietly. A successful visit for President Zelensky to Britain, and some issues being raised about leaked documents in the Washington Post and whether or not there's growing American reluctance to back this. So where do we go when we talk about this? To Marcus Kolga. He's our go-to guy on this. Writer, expert on Russian and European foreign policy, senior fellow for foreign policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. The list is so long, but this is his specialty. You know him because he's been here before. Marcus, welcome. Where do you think we are today? What's going on?
Well, look, I think we're at the point of a significant change in the tide of this war. We're now 15 months into a war that Vladimir Putin initially said was a 3-day operation.
Yep.
Things have only gone from bad to worse for Vladimir Putin, certainly over the past 5 to 6 months, where he has focused much of his efforts on taking this strategically relatively unimportant town of Bakhmut. He has his forces have endured over 100,000 casualties in taking that town since December. He is running out of weapons. There was recent reports that T-55 tanks were being sent to the front. These are tanks that were built in the 1950s and 1960s and have been basically in storage since the Cold War. That's what he's now sending to the front for his troops. And Ukraine is clearly making some gains. It's been making gains over the past few days around Bakhmut, taking around 20 square kilometers of territory back from the Russians. And so there's a real sense that that there is a change coming, that the momentum is on Ukraine's side ahead of this coming spring offensive. And Vladimir Putin is definitely back on his heels at this point, and the hope is that spring offensive will be successful, because that's really what Ukraine needs. It's what the Western world needs. It's what democracy needs, is for Ukraine to push back Russia beyond the borders that were violated in February of last year, and to retake Crimea as well if possible.
I was a little surprised to read that the Wagner group, the mercenary army that Putin has brought into service here in Ukraine, they're even kind of trash talking the Russian military and threatening to, leak secrets. I'm sure that's a negotiating plea to, get more money, but those guys don't usually play that way.
Yeah, well, the cracks are certainly appearing around Vladimir Putin. The fact that Yevgeny Prigozhin, this is an oligarch who made much of his money catering Vladimir Putin's government. He's known as Vladimir Putin's chef, of course. The fact that he is coming out and publicly criticizing the Kremlin's leadership, the leadership of the Russian armed forces, even going so far as to call them traitors, the Minister of Defense a traitor, for not having sent him the ammunition that he needs to take Bakhmut. I mean, that's a serious, quite a serious signal. And this recent leak that Prigozhin had reached out to Ukraine's military leadership, offering them intelligence on Russian positions if they allowed him to take Bakhmut, that's treason. And if that's what's happening inside those within the Kremlin and those around Vladimir Putin, that there is a shift inside the leadership, and that there's a real threat to, I think, Vladimir Putin himself and his position.
A couple of questions for you just about where the West is. You know, we've talked about this before, that we have a notoriously short attention span. Right at the beginning, everybody gets their flags out and puts it on their T-shirts, and then we kind of move on. And Canada hasn't really been able to contribute all that much. I mean, it's a problem with tanks that need 4 other tanks to make sure they've got the spare parts for them. But just in the larger question, those who are playing ball here, a good meeting, would you say, with the British Prime Minister and Prime Minister Zelensky? Do you think there's an important signal in that?
Well, look, I think that that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian armed forces have done a great job of maintaining the attention of a lot of Western governments, demonstrating that they can push back against Russia, even over the past few weeks. The fact that 4 Russian fighter jets were taken down over Russia, we don't know whether they were Ukrainian forces that did that. They're playing coy about it. There have been dozens of sabotage events, so to speak, across Russia over the past few weeks. And the fact that they've held on to Bakhmut and are pushing back Russian forces has really, I think, emboldened Western leaders and I think reinforced their confidence in Ukraine, in Zelensky. And so, yeah, I think that it's been a good week for Zelensky. He received commitments for more weapons, more ammunition from Western allies. Certainly, Rishi Sunak. There's now talk of a coalition to send F-16s to Ukraine. This is something that was, rejected pretty much a couple of months ago. It was off the tables, but now it seems to be on the table. Poland has said that they probably can't send F-16s. They need them themselves, but they are willing to train pilots. Rishi Sunak has committed to training pilots. So all of this means that the West will be sending those fighter jets. And clearly, the air defenses that we've been sending them, they've made a difference over the past few days. There was this massive missile attack on Kiev a couple of nights ago. All of those missiles were shot down thanks to the weapons that the West has supplied them. And another positive sign is, of course, Germany. Germany.
Yeah, I was just going to say that they finally stepped up.
They've really stepped up. They're, I think, the number 2 supplier of weapons now to Ukraine behind the U.S. And that's an important signal. Both, I mean, obviously, in practical terms of defending Ukraine, but politically, it sends an extremely important and tough signal to Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin was relying on Germany not to send those weapons. And I think what's most remarkable after all these months of war is that Western resolve and unity is strong, and that's largely thanks, like I said, to President Zelensky and his armed forces in proving that they can do it and that they can push back and defend their country.
The debate seems to go back and forth. We know that there's a strong view amongst Republicans, but also some Democrats in the US that, a little bit more focus on America and less fighting foreign wars. But the flip side of that are all the stories that America is doing a lot more than we know they're doing. They just want to be quiet about it. What's your view of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising, and it wouldn't surprise me if America was doing a lot more than we publicly know it's doing. As for the certain elements within the Republican Party, certain elements within the Democrat, I would say that they're the far left of the Democratic Party and the far right of the Republican Party. I'm not sure that they represent the real views of either of those parties, and certainly the traditional Republican position has been to defend democracy and the sovereignty of our allies. And so, the fact that people like Ron DeSantis, Tucker Carlson, are exploiting the war for partisan purposes is repugnant, and I hope it's something that will end soon. Because it doesn't. I think that the problem when you have these individuals on the far left and far right, often even repeating Russian narratives regarding Ukraine, that there's a threat that spreads and spreads into towards the center. There's no sign of that right now. It seems like this the erosion of support for Ukraine is limited to the far right and the far left. But it's something that's also affecting Canadian politics as well. And we're seeing that amongst certainly amongst some conservatives in the far left here in Canada too. So hopefully that doesn't spread too much further, but it doesn't seem to be impacting, at least in the United States, the level of support that they're providing for Ukraine.
Yeah, the trouble is when you're heading into, which you're perpetually in the United States, an election year, this stuff doesn't tend to go away. It tends to get a bit louder and used in those situations. So you've talked about the state of the Russian military, and that they're not even looking very combat capable at this particular point. But the Ukrainians are taking a huge hit. I mean, this is costing, we lost 2 Canadian lives there too, but this is tens of thousands of young, able-bodied men and women who, are gone.
Well, thanks for, I think, reminding your viewers and listeners of that. I mean, it's ultimately Ukraine that's paying the price here. It's these Ukrainian soldiers that are losing their lives on the front lines. They are rather remarkably standing up against these waves of what they call Russian orcs that are coming at them, especially in Bakhmut. I mean, the stories you hear of that situation there are horrifying. These are ex-convicts that are being pulled out of Russian prisons who are just being thrown to the front lines, much like they were during the Second World War by the Russians, where they have antiquated weapons, and it's just wave after wave after wave that these brave young and old Ukrainians, let's not forget.
Yes,
I mean,
it's
not just young Ukrainians. There are
everybody's showing up.
Everybody's showing up to defend their homes and their homeland. And they're repelling these attacks. Meanwhile, you have these cities like Bakhmut that have been bombed in just to smithereens by Russian forces. They're trying to do the same in other Ukrainian cities, and we've seen it happen. So the civilian toll has been massive. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have lost their lives. Let's not forget, we just had a report a few months ago about how Russia was forcibly deporting Ukrainian children to Russia, basically kidnapping children. And then, of course, we can't forget what happened in Bucha earlier on in this war, where hundreds of civilians were tortured, executed. Women were as old as 80 were raped. Children, the UN has reported that children as young as 4 had been raped by Russian soldiers. So Ukraine is paying the ultimate price in this, and the Ukrainians are paying the ultimate price for this war. And what I think all Canadians need to remember is that this is the front line of civilization, democracy right now. The Ukrainians are fighting this for us. And so it's so critically important that we here in Canada and that our allies continue supplying Ukraine with the weapons, the tools it needs to fight for democracy on our behalf. And that it pushes Ukraine, or rather it pushes Putin's forces out of Ukraine as quickly as possible to stop the suffering in Ukraine and to stabilize the Europe and the Western world.
You can't help but just keep coming back that if we'd drawn the line in the sand around Crimea, we might not be dealing with this today.
Well, Senator, I think, I was advocating for us to wake up to the reality of what Vladimir Putin represented, the threat that he represented already back in 2007, when he tried to destabilize Estonia through his embassy in Estonia and engaged in the first ever state-sponsored cyber attacks against Estonia. We saw this trajectory, some of us did, back then, and we saw Russian forces invade Georgia the following year in 2008. Then, of course, we saw what happened in Crimea in 2014. We saw him along with the Syrian regime bomb Aleppo back to the Stone Ages. So, we've seen this going on over and over again, and it's good to see that the Western world has finally realized and the threat that he represents, and that we're standing up against him through Ukraine, and have been doing so over the past 15 months.
One of the things that really troubles me and makes me nervous, as I'm sure it does a lot of people, which is the nuclear plant that the Russians are holding. This is Europe's largest nuclear plant, I think. And there have been attempts by the Ukrainians to get it back. The Russians haven't forfeited, and it's kind of in an area that allows them to keep their supply chains, to whatever degree they're capable of, moving. But there they are, sitting in a nuke plant, and as you say, these are people with nothing to gain or lose on the Russian side. They're mercenary in all ways. That one always makes me nervous.
Well, look, the threat of nuclear war, the threat of causing some sort of a potential meltdown at Zaporizhia. This is, of course, that nuclear plant, as you mentioned, in sort of the southwest, sort of southeast corner of Ukraine. That threat has always been thrown out there by the Russian government, and it's been doing that, ever since the start of this conflict, and even before that. Former President Dmitry Medvedev every few weeks comes out and makes this statement that reminds us that Russia does have nuclear weapons, that there is this plant in Ukraine that could through the war and through this conflict and Western support, of course, might experience some sort of a catastrophe. And so that threat is always looming. I think the threat of nuclear war, I think that's something that we can ignore as saber rattling, largely because Vladimir Putin, although he's not particularly strategic or bright when it comes to making these geopolitical decisions, he's not suicidal either. He knows that if he engages in any sort of nuclear warfare, I think that even with a manufactured catastrophe at Zaporizhia, everyone would know who's behind it. The Ukrainians certainly do not want to irradiate their country, and I think he understands. Vladimir Putin very clearly understands the consequences of doing something like that.
The West would have to respond.
The West would have to respond, but I think that the few friends that he has in the authoritarian world would also have to respond. Maybe not North Korea, but certainly China. China would not tolerate that sort of action. And right now, Vladimir Putin is really he's relying on China's support. Right now, he's hoping that he can continue trading, selling his cheap oil and resources to China. If he were to cause any sort of nuclear catastrophe, I think all of that would end. It would mean an end to Vladimir Putin himself, and he knows that. So, although I think we should all be concerned with what is happening there, and it's possible that there may be a rogue element within the Russian army, someone like a Prigozhin, maybe someone else who might cause that catastrophe in order to completely destabilize the Kremlin and try to take power. That is something that could. I mean, it's a remote possibility, but again, any expectation that Vladimir Putin might engage in nuclear warfare or cause a nuclear catastrophe, I think is pretty far-fetched.
I'm going to ask Chris Alexander, our next guest, coming up in just a moment, this question too. But how do you think this ends?
It ends with Vladimir Putin leaving the Kremlin feet first. Things are not going well. There's no prospect of things improving for Vladimir Putin. His leadership, his military leadership, is completely incoherent. There's no real strategy. He is running out of resources. He is running out of troops. He is running out of weapons. And Russia's economy is teetering right now. The data that we're getting about it is all from the Kremlin, so it cannot be trusted. Popularity for the war in Russia, although polls say that it's high, Russians will say that they support the war when you put a gun to their head. That's what's happening. But from all indications, young Russians, they're getting fed up with what's going on. And so I think that Vladimir Putin's own position right now is being threatened. I think that we should expect the Ukrainians to be successful in its spring offensive. They may not take they may not take Crimea.
Right.
Let's hope that they do, but they will push back Russia's forces, I think, beyond that February 22 border. If that happens, that is a major defeat domestically for Vladimir Putin. And I think that he's right now trying to position himself through Yevgeny Prigozhin to find a scapegoat for all of this in his senior military leadership. I think right now, as the situation stands, if the situation were frozen, I think that Vladimir Putin has suffered a major geopolitical defeat. And like I said, I think there's a real threat to his position. And I think we need to be prepared. The Western world needs to prepare itself for a world beyond Vladimir Putin. That may mean that someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin or Patrushev, the former head of the FSB, people like that may take over the Kremlin. And I think that we should prepare ourselves for a period of instability, but also prepare Russians for a democratic future. And that means supporting civil society, independent media, and such, so that when the time comes that they have the tools they need to reform Russia, and like I said, turn it towards democracy and the Western world, because that future will be coming, but it may be a long way off.
Yeah. Well, that's where your skills will again come into play. Communication strategist, writer, expert on Russian European foreign policy. And you just spent a lot of time thinking about this, and thank you for your insights. When you describe him leaving feet first, I guess we can only hope that happens at some point. Marcus Kobus, thank you very much. And now to Chris Alexander. Chris previously served as a diplomat in Russia and Afghanistan. In fact, that is where our paths first crossed. He was a member of parliament, served as Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. He is a fellow at the Canadian International Council and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and a principal, of course, at Hacklit. This is a international consulting firm. Am I even close, Chris? Am I even close on the name?
Absolutely. Hacklit.
Okay, good. We'll leave it there, and I'll never say it again until I've got it in my head. Look, we're just finished our conversation with Marcus, and we ended on the note which is very hard for you to begin on, but let's do it anyway. How does this situation in Ukraine come to an end? Marcus, of course, saying it's going to take Putin coming out of the Kremlin feet first, and that's not likely to happen immediately, but it may. What are your thoughts?
First of all, great you were speaking to Marcus. He's a Canadian authority, international authority on these issues, and I agree with him. Defeat for Russia in Ukraine, defeat of this disastrous genocidal adventure, will mean the end of Putin's regime, of Putin's time in charge. I think that's happened often over Russian history when there have been decisive defeats. And so it depends on this spring offensive. It depends on the waves of offensives that the Ukrainians are talking about, how quickly they succeed, what the scale of Western support continues to be and then becomes. It's been growing, as you know. Things could change if the Ukrainians surprise us again very quickly. I'm an optimist with regard to Ukraine's capabilities, but they still have 20%, 17% roughly of their country to liberate. So we can't expect this to happen in a matter of weeks, and it may not happen this year. God forbid it's a longer term grind. But we all have an interest in speeding up this process. There is, and there won't be, stability even after Putin's gone, even after Russian troops have left Ukraine, because it's going to be hard for Russia to come to terms with a situation in which they don't have decisive influence in Ukraine, and eventually they don't have decisive influence in Belarus. I mean, these are territories that have been part, in one way or another, of a Russian empire since, some of them, the late 17th century, the 18th century.
that he wants back, just on a point of principle. And so,
yeah, and a point of imperialism, right?
yes, of imperialism for sure. The issue of our commitment and the West, and we talked about this a little bit. The West kind of comes and goes, although we're seeing with Britain, we're seeing with Germany, we're seeing with, even in the US, despite the debate, there's more going in terms of equipment, and probably on the US side, a little more behind the scenes that we don't know about. But is it enough? I mean, if we had done this at the front end, it might have been a little bit more helpful.
Agreed. In fact, you and I would probably agree that if there had been a more principled approach after 2014,
exactly,
a further invasion could well have been deterred, but that would have had to involve naval action in the Black Sea. It would have had to involve larger scale military support for Ukraine. I mean, Canada was the first country to start training the Ukrainian army. We did that before the US and the UK did. And the US trained them for 7 years without really giving them military equipment that was modern. So it has been slow. But since last year, the US has really stepped up. Yeah. They are by far the most important contributors. You're right. There's some things we don't see on the intelligence side and so forth that are really important enablers. But they are giving the bulk of the support, far more than all the other countries combined. And there are three other main nodes of military support for Ukraine. One are the frontline states, the eastern flank of NATO countries, the little Baltics, who are spending 1% of their GDP in support of Ukraine, plus, and especially Lithuania, plus Poland, plus the Czech Republic. They're very serious about this. The second node is the UK, which really helped to break the ice on tanks, and is now breaking the ice on long-range cruise missiles, long-range fire systems. And now finally, better late than never, you have Germany, who took the important step on tanks and are now taking other important steps with billions of euros of military commitments. They're the biggest country in Europe, and their contribution means a lot. Just one side note, Canada has nothing to be proud of here. I'm disappointed that both our government and our opposition aren't giving this the attention it deserves. I looked at a ranking by the Kiel Institute, which is quite impartial, of commitments by percentage of GDP, and we are 29th out of 40 donors. Very far down the list.
And we have a huge Ukrainian diaspora in this country. I mean, certainly in my part of the world, in Saskatchewan, that's who came. That's who
we could do so much more. And we have done in the past so much more under liberal and conservative governments. At the moment, we're really behind our peers and behind, underperforming in terms of what we could do.
You were part of the diplomatic world, and you know how awkward and slow that can sometimes be, but how important it also is. When you were in Russia, did you see then any signs of hope about any kind of open discussion or ability? What we're seeing now is, the Wagner Group try and bully the president a little bit, probably for cash. We don't know what their motives would be to help out Ukraine, but is there anything left of what might come next?
So far as I can see, and I haven't been in Russia since 2009, and I've been on their sanctions list, obviously, as many of us now are.
Yes, we are.
No desire to go or possibility of going. But the free speech among Russians today does not happen at all inside the country. Even around kitchen tables, I think people are extremely guarded because the state is everywhere, listening to you through your telephone, listening to you through your neighbors. It's become really a fascist, totalitarian type state. The free voices there are outside Russia.
Right.
In Berlin, in Vilnius, In the United States, Garry Kasparov, the chess grandmaster, I think is one of the true leaders of the Russian opposition, very vocal in his support for Ukraine. But that is a dramatic change from the 1990s. There was real free speech in the 1990s. Right. There was diversity of opinion. There were real rough and tumble politics, which Yeltsin came out on top of. Putin started dismantling that immediately on coming into office as prime minister in 99 and then elected president in 2000. And it's been just a gradual, slow burn, accelerating in the last few years to the point where it's really zero. If you say something anti-regime on Telegram or Twitter, which still operate in Russia, they will come and knock on your door or your families. There will be consequences, and there are hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions of people, devoted in Russia today to stamping out internal dissent. So it's a country that is under huge pressure, that is brainwashed by the propaganda that flows out of the main TV channels, and it's genocidal. I mean, a lot of Russians support this idea that the only way to deal with Ukraine is by killing more people. And it's sad to say that. We all have Russian friends. We all know how brilliant Russians, that population, that country has been in the past, how creative. They are under a dark cloud right now, and Putin has taken them in almost the most dangerous imaginable direction.
Is there anything else? I mean, he's been declared, the war criminal. There are calls to expel Russia from the UN, which I still don't understand. Maybe you can explain to me why they sit on the Security Council. I mean, that was a Soviet Union position in the first place, not a Russian position. But why did we allow that? I mean, Bill Browder, who's well known, for his critiques of what goes on there, because of his personal loss of his lawyer. But that we need to actually define Russia as a state sponsor of terror. We need to do this.
I absolutely agree with Bill. I think everything we've done has had an impact, but can be done better, can be done in a more complete way, and that goes from military support. Why are we still talking about F-16s?
Yeah,
the Ukrainians need the ability not just to shoot cruise missiles fired at them out of the air, but to stop the aircraft that are approaching with these payloads. They'll only do that with Western fighter jets. We're on the verge of that decision, but it should have been taken much earlier. Sanctions. A lot has been done, but there are still Russian banks that are operating. There are still the oil sales are up this month, mostly to India and China. But there are things, a lot of circumvention of sanctions is happening through Georgia and Armenia and Dubai, UAE. There can be secondary sanctions. There can be a much tougher approach to tighten the regime. And then the symbolic issues really do matter as well. There is a great paper out there by CEPA, a European think tank, CEPA, that lays out very clearly how Russia could be removed from the Security Council by a vote of the General Assembly. And the numbers are potentially there. We've seen it on votes on other resolutions. So why is it not happening?
Yeah.
One, it's never been done before.
Right.
And diplomats are just notoriously
cautious
and conservative in the really negative sense of the word. Two, there is no leader that has really taken this on, who has the power to convene and to galvanize other countries. And thirdly, the other members, permanent members, are not sure they want this issue looked at, because the UK wonders what will happen if there's a real reform to their seat. France wonders whether the EU will try to slip in to its seat, and the United States, doesn't have the bandwidth with so many issues going on to take on the major issue of UN reform. So it's stuck, but it's really unfortunate because it discredits the UN. The League of Nations, which was a much less capable, much more flawed organization, threw out the Soviet Union a few months after they invaded Finland in 1939.
So other bodies like NATO, I mean, there needs to be a little bit more, I think, coordination in the response instead of one-offs. I mean, Britain declares, Russia or the Wagner group, terrorists. Like, we're doing bits and pieces, but we kind of need to put it all together on that front as well.
Absolutely. And we need to bring this effort out of this sort of ad hoc fora where it's now being handled into the main fora, where we should be dealing with these very consequential issues. I mean, it's a bit of a puzzle to me, Pamela, why NATO, which, sent every resource it had almost to Afghanistan for 20 years, it still doesn't have a mission that is devoted to supporting Ukraine. We'll see where we get on that at the Vilnius summit, which is coming up soon, but should be at least be a training mission or a supply mission. And my sense is that if we were training, Canada and others, if we were training Ukrainians on the ground in Ukraine up to December of last year, why aren't we doing it now? Again, with air defenses in place, to give the Ukrainians that edge and the scale to their effort that they need to win. We have to. We're still not approaching this with a posture that looks like we really are fully committed to Ukraine winning. And here there's
just one more point. With the release of secret documents in the US with a very pessimistic view of that. I mean, that doesn't help either, right?
It doesn't. And it kind of forces the Ukrainians to push the envelope on their own. I mean, let's be honest, back in January, February, when all this US intelligence was being published about what the Russians were going to do, the private US and UK assessment was that Ukraine would collapse, the Russians would occupy Kyiv, and there would be a partisan war, irregular war fought. That did not happen. But our military support still looks a bit like, it's still configured a bit for that result, which didn't happen.
Right.
What I think many of us who are strong supporters of Ukraine, I know Marcus would agree with this, would like to see is NATO, the US, countries like Canada actually explicitly endorse Ukraine's war aims, which are, we are fighting for victory. We will keep fighting until we have a full victory. And that means liberating all of our territory, not just what was occupied starting last year, but everything that was occupied starting in 2014. The 1991 borders have to be upheld. And that shouldn't be a hard goal for us to embrace, because that's that principle of the inviolability of borders is at the absolute core of the UN Charter, to which we've been committed since 1945, which is the foundation stone of our whole international system since then. And
we have your back and we'll be with you to the end kind of comment.
Yeah, as long as it takes. I mean, if you're Ukrainian, you're asking, as long as it takes to do what?
Yeah. And without your equipment, it's going to take longer.
Exactly. And
don't have my back, have my front, please. Yeah.
Putin gets to mobilize more people, get all his private sector corrupt oligarchs to put their own paramilitary forces into the field. I mean, the mess just gets worse.
Yeah. You raised the Afghan point, and you and I share a real interest and commitment there. And we watched with horror as the West withdrew. It was bad enough that they did, but the way they did it was appalling. People hanging from airplanes. We've still got men and women in Afghanistan who served with our troops, living in Afghanistan under threat of death on an hourly basis. What lesson, because this is going to be a situation eventually down the road, what lesson do we learn from that about what the West needs to be ready for?
Well, we cannot start something and leave it unfinished, especially when it's a mission that ticked all the boxes, that had full support from the UN, was fully legal. It was not an invasion. It was an authorized mission with the support of Afghans to prevent their country from being ruled by terrorists. It had NATO support. It had partner countries beyond NATO involved. We should never embark on such a mission without a firm commitment to completing it. And what would completing it have involved in this case? One very simple set of policies that we failed to embrace, Pamela, and you know this very well, dealing with Pakistan. I mean, it's the way we dealt with Afghanistan is a bit as if we were saying today in Ukraine, well, these are separatists in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainians can defeat them, but we mustn't succumb to the jump to the conclusion that they are supported from Russia, because that's not proven. Well, that's exactly what we did in Afghanistan. We fought the Taliban. We beat them every time on the battlefield, but we let them go back to a larger neighboring country, resupply, regroup, expand, and we never even sanctioned Pakistan for that support. So you have to deal with the whole region. You have to deal with the conflict in all of its dimensions. And in Afghanistan, we failed utterly. That led to unending disaster for Afghans. It's painful just to think of it. But it also, our weakness shown in the summer of 2021, prompted Putin to speed up his planning for this large scale. So two conclusions. One, if you're going to do something, do it seriously, deal with all the dimensions, finish it properly, and recognize that if you get it wrong, when you have a failure, it's going to lead to failures otherwise. There are other dictators and opportunists in the world, spoilers, that are going to take advantage of the disarray, the kind of disarray we showed in the summer of 2021. So, it comes down to leadership. There was weariness. The issues weren't explained to people. There were no top level really leaders explaining why Pakistan was the real issue. Electorates lose interest and get cynical when they're not being given the straight goods.
No, for sure. I mean, it just the phrase "courage of your conviction." I mean, it's easy to rally around, and as I said to Marcus, put the T-shirt on with the flag. But this is serious stuff, and it's going to cost, and it's going to take time, and we're either in or we're not.
Exactly, and it's historic because, as with Afghanistan, which has a conflict that's gone on for many decades now, so with Russia, they have not only flouted international law under Putin, invading, by my sort of reckoning, two countries a decade, which is even more than the Soviet Union invaded. It was more like one country a decade. And then before that, leading into the Second World War, they were Hitler's ally. I mean, this is the belligerent in the Second World War that never got punished at all and instead got a permanent seat on the Security Council. Before that, they weren't even present at the Paris peace negotiations after the First World War and held to the more limited threshold of accountability back then, which meant that Bolsheviks, after the revolution, Lenin in this case, felt he had a free hand to snuff out Belarusian independence, Ukrainian independence, and start moving westwards again. So this impunity that Putin has and this neo-imperialist impulse that he has grown up over a long period. And it doesn't affect just Ukraine or countries in Central Europe. It's affecting Africa. Look at the coup d'etat there. It's affecting our democracy. Look at their disinformation and propaganda. They are an aggressive country whose unchecked impunity has had dire consequences for the whole world.
Well, and I mean, the United States, in terms of involving themselves in campaigns directly. And
their last hope, arguably, is for Trump to win and say, we're not doing anything more for Zelensky in Ukraine. And sad to say, that is not an impossible scenario.
Nope, absolutely
we
not.
all hope it won't happen. Most,
But a rerun of Trump and Biden, that's 6
how has it come to this?
Of the other.
And how can he not be convicted by this point of being an agent of foreign influence, of being, for all the tax evasion and fraud that he stands accused of, not to mention the sexual harassment and other patterns of criminal misconduct that are on his. I mean, it's a real failing of the U.S. political system and of the information system, because the Russians are just pouring their poison and their lies onto these social media platforms, and in some cases into even more respectable channels, and it reaches a certain amount of Americans and sort of activates that isolationist impulse that is always present in the United States.
Wow. Chris, it's great to talk to you. Great to see you. You're enjoying your work at Hacklit. Did I say that right?
I am enjoying my work at Hacklit and staying involved in these issues. And it's great to know that you're keeping these issues front and center. We need to keep talking about them. Canada's role matters. Canada's parliament takes positions that matter. But there's no bigger issue right now in terms of dealing with China and the whole international system than ensuring Ukraine's success, as far as I'm concerned. That will have if Ukrainians are victorious sooner rather than later, it's going to have a knock-on effect in Europe, in Asia, and well beyond that will be historic. So let's and
then we can really begin to kind of see how the geopolitical stuff shifts, right? That will be a game changer for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Chris. We'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
Looking forward to it. Thanks again.
Thanks. That is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you again soon.